Howdy, all of you delicious people. Today I'm here to quote unquote face the music. Ultimately, I'm here to review Bill and Ted's Face the Music. So, since I have been within this movie and then got out of it, how do I feel about it? So, ultimately, I can go and let you know. If you want to go into theaters and watch this movie, go right ahead. Or you can make a much more reasonable choice and stay at home and go into Vudu, VUDU, and rent the movie if to your heart's content, if that's what you want to do. Or ultimately, you can go to Amazon and again rent this movie out and without a doubt watch it, which is the more reasonable thing, especially for this film. Going into this movie, I seen the trailer and I'm just like, and then I watched this movie and I was just kind of like, you know what? I didn't see really anything like all that much more exciting in the film that I didn't get from the trailer. Or like within this movie, I was hoping to just kind of get some little thing out of this, like some little victory, some little cool, interesting thing that I could take away from this film. And I never really quite got there. Some people might have just went into this movie or this and that because it could be simply called fun. Like, yeah, I just went into this film because I thought it was fun. Like, I didn't put much thought into it. I just went in there and just saw this thing. If you're hearing any kind of noises, weather is going on in the place of which I am at. But so, Bill and Ted's Face the Music basically is just kind of a rehashing of all their other movies, but then on top of that, like there really isn't any kind of payout whatsoever in this film, sadly enough. But I think that this movie should have really went straight to like Amazon as a Prime member thing, or it should have went too quickly to some streaming service, and there you go. I guess they were just banking on nostalgic fans that ultimately loved the other movies, and now we're going into this one just going, why? This movie kind of breaks off as like Dumb and Dumber 2. It kind of breaks off as just one of those, hey, you waited way too long to do a sequel, and then you get this. Like a Ghostbusters or like a any number of other things where they waited way too long and then here you go, and it's like, what is this? Like, what is this ultimately? Like, what does it really break down to? Of because we were expecting a Bill and Ted movie and we never 100% got that. It goes through like Bill and Ted the family version of journeys and this and that, and then also it also goes into um, maybe too many Bill and Teds at some point in another, and this and that. So like, yeah, this movie was like, I guess you can really just break it down as just like fun, like nostalgia, whatever, of previous Bill and Ted movies. But other than that, it's just like this should have been free somewhere. This should have been free somewhere. Prime membership, something like that. It should have been under a free umbrella, instead of having you weather the CV storm to go and see this in a theater. New Mutants seems like a viable thing to go into theater to see, Uh, Tenet sounds like a viable thing to go to a theater and see, and um, God, there's some other movie that's coming out today that's probably very viable to see. Ultimately, yeah, this one is not that, sadly enough. So I think it's about that time to break it down into spoiler territory. I'm probably gonna rush through probably the spoiler variation of this movie, just because it's like it's a rough sell. Such a rough sell to really just go and just like, yeah, I want to just talk about only the Bill and Ted moments, and that's it. Only the Bill and Ted moments. I don't really care about anything else, but you guys need to know how this movie goes. So I think it's about that time to already bust into the spoiler count. Because ultimately, yeah, this movie, like, it's not worth spending too much time on. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time is about that time again to spoil this movie. For Keanu Reeves lovers, ultimately, they would probably just go into this movie regardless because it's Keanu Reeves, and he's such a nice guy. But otherwise, it's just no, no for this movie. It's just why wait so long to give us a recycled mess? So we go into this film now at spoiler times. We basically give you a flashback of Bill and Ted through the other movies, and then flashbacking or basically telling us how horrible their career has plummeted down through the decades. How basically they kept putting album and album and album out, and they just completely gone to complete obscurity, and how they eventually just end up playing at weddings is just kind of like, well, yeah, it's like nobody's gonna book these guys, sadly, and so they ultimately make this speech to all their family members, and basically it kind of gets to the aspect of like they kind of break down how this one girl who had seemingly dated every single person in every single family, and now it's led to her dating this other guy, and then they got married, and so ultimately Keanu Reeves' character is supposedly his own uncle. Keanu Reeves' father is his own father, I believe, and this and that, and so they end up playing this song, and it makes not much of a rational sense. But ultimately, it's basically like, who cares? Let's get through this song portion of this opening movie, and they ultimately have their kids that are there at the wedding, and they're like, "Man, that throat singing you were doing, wow, what an interesting thing." Because basically, these guys were trying as hard as humanly possible to come up with a song that would save the world. That they kind of eventually came down to the point where like the song that they wrote didn't save the world. It just eventually like the world moved on, and they forgot about Bill and Ted. Uh, Anyways, so we go and we have these daughters who are ultimately kind of complimenting their fathers and this and that. And so eventually we have Bill and Ted having to go to the future right away. Ultimately, they go to the future, and they eventually see a Rufus hologram in some phone booth, and this character is mentioning that he had at some point like gone back in time for the first time to try to save the world. So eventually, Bill and Ted is met by like this like hierarching character, this future queen or whatever, and she ultimately mentions to Bill and Ted that basically like you were supposed to like unite the world and save the world or whatever, but you didn't. Like if anything, like you were supposed to be like rich and famous and well known and whatever, but instead you're uh, flipping the bill for doing a wedding singing gig. It's like this is not where you were supposed to end up, and this and that. And they're like, well, yeah, it's like we tried so hard to find this song, and just it never happened. So ultimately, they tell them, well, you have to come up with one more song to save the universe, because ultimately every single character in history is being taken out of certain time periods and put in different time periods. Uh, we have like Babe Ruth that is now in his wrong and is now in a wrong timeline. We have Jesus who is taken out of his timeline and put into a different timeline. George Washington, uh, any number of different kind of like big wigged. A little loud out there with the weather. Any bigwig names are ultimately all going into and being teleported into different timelines. There's so much like things are just appearing when they should not be. Like the whole timeline thing is all getting muckety mucked because again, Bill and Ted don't have this song. So ultimately, they say, well, hey, yeah, we have to come up with this song in OG 75 minutes, which is basically the length of pretty much the entire rest of the movie. And so ultimately, they concoct this master plan to ultimately try to steal their own song from themselves. And they figure to go to their future selves and find this song. Well, every single time they go back, it seems like their lives get worse the further they go into their future. So here's the breakdown. So Bill and Ted go 2 years into the future thinking like, well, clearly like 2 year us is going to be able to find this answer of this song. So they ultimately go to find their 2 year selves and they go into some like bar dive, and ultimately their 2 year selves are kind of very much Keanu Reeves' character has this like long goatee, and both Bill and Ted are kind of very much like they're very grungy looking. Uh, they're very flames on shirts and all kinds of like the lowest of the low that they could go, and like the cheapest looking clothes and this and that. So Bill and Ted go to their own Bill and Ted's, and their Bill and Ted's from 2 years in the future, they start running away from them. So Bill and Ted is chasing Bill and Ted, and they both find one another, and like the Bill and Ted kind of corners them. Says like, "Hey man, like shouldn't you have known that we were coming to you?" And like and future Bill and Ted were like, yeah, we knew you were coming, but it's like we don't have the song. And ultimately they kind of mentioned, they're like, yeah, and also your wives' future selves have gone to your what, like the past uh Bill and Ted, Bill and Ted's wives, and told them that they need to experience all these other timelines to know that they're never really going to be truly happy with Bill and Ted. So they need to come up with some kind of like thing for their wives to be happy, because ultimately um past Bill and Ted takes, or like the most present Bill and Ted, I guess. Present Bill and Ted? Present Bill and Ted. Yeah. Present Bill and Ted ultimately go to couples therapy with their wives. The only thing is, they simultaneously, both couples go at the same time and do couples therapy. To where ultimately, Bill and Ted are talking to their wives and they're consistently saying, "We love you," and all kinds of like, really just like, okay, this doesn't quite, like, they're not really mending any fences, they're not really having a breakthrough in therapy. It's just like they're saying like all this stuff that doesn't really quite really resonate, to just kind of like go like, dude, I think I should just leave you. So eventually, yeah, like they eventually just like the the girls eventually lead to meet their future selves, and then ultimately they go into the future because they have to go and ultimately go into the future. So yeah, so we find out that 2 year Bill and Ted are very much drunken schlobs and whatever, because ultimately their wives had left them and they never came back. So ultimately they're just like, well, yeah, well, like, it's like, well, it's your fault because you didn't come up with this song. Um, 2 year Keanu Reeves, and then like Keanu Reeves just goes like, well, maybe you should have came up with the song, and rah rah rah. So basically, we have them repetitiously going further and further into the future to keep seeing their future selves. So eventually they go to meeting their other selves, and in a more distant time, and they find out that they have been uh, these Bill and Teds have been very British, and that they came up with some song and that they're gonna give it to them, and surefire enough, like these people are like, heck yeah, like this is awesome. And so they open the door, and like David Graw, the guy from, or the guy from who's the lead singer of Foo Fighters and this and that, he was ultimately at this door, and then they realized, like the Bill and Ted from present Bill and Ted realized that they had been had by future Bill and Ted, and ultimately they come back to them, and they realize that they're still like fat again, and that they're still like one's really losing their hair, and ultimately they're gonna tell them the truth that it's ultimately just like, well, hey, we didn't come up with a song to save the universe, but the guy from the Foo Fighters, he did. So there you go. Like, here's a future song. There you go. And so ultimately they're just like, well, hey, we can't steal that from him. Like, it's not our fault we couldn't come up with this song. So evidently the cops are called because, again, like, somebody's in someone's house. And so ultimately Bill and Ted try to run away from their future selves and try to get out of their house and fall out of their house the only way they know how. And then eventually they get this robotish character that is sent from the future to try and kill them if they don't have the song. So eventually we also find out that Bill and Ted's daughters are going to try and figure out a way to help their fathers figure out how to do a new song. So they go and travel back in time and get a bunch of musical iconish characters to ultimately help them put a new song together. They eventually, at first, go to Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix is like, dude, I'm not gonna freaking buy that. Like, I'm not gonna buy that you're gonna like want me to do this, and like, come on, there's no. So ultimately, considering they couldn't convince Jimi Hendrix, they get some celebrity to ultimately convince Jimi Hendrix to do what he needs to do. And so they go back in time to get Louis Armstrong. So they ultimately get Louis Armstrong to go to Jimi Hendrix to tell Jimi Hendrix, like, hey man, you need to do this. And so Jimi Hendrix is like, dude, that's not Louis Armstrong. It's like, Louis Armstrong is like 65. And so they're like, oh crap, we didn't like get like Louis Armstrong, like older Louis Armstrong. We got like the younger Louis Armstrong. Is like, admittedly, I was thinking that we should have gotten older Louis Armstrong, but I guess that was just me. So they ended up getting a younger Louis Armstrong. Then they ended up getting Jimi Hendrix because ultimately Louis Armstrong plays some notes on the trumpet, and Jimi Hendrix is like, ah, and like they're like, ah, and then they go together. So Jimi Hendrix, Louis Armstrong, and the two daughters are now traveling in time to go and get Mozart. And I'm just like, hopefully there's a legitimate point to all this, getting this character. And after that, like, once they arrive, Mozart is playing some song, and Jimi Hendrix is in the background playing his guitar. So it becomes like a battle off between Jimi Hendrix playing his guitar and Mozart playing on this piano, and it seems like Jimi Hendrix is winning, and Mozart just wants to go, hey, yeah, like, let's go and let's play together. So eventually they go and they find some flute player, which I'm ultimately just like, okay, I don't know who this is, but they ended up getting her. And then eventually they arrive into, and they also got some drummer, which I didn't know, I don't remember who that person was. And so they eventually go into quasi current time and get a rap star called Kid Cudi, who I'd ultimately seen in a couple movies here and there. So I'm like, oh, okay, so this guy is really racking up. I think he was on Jexy, I think. this guy is really racking up, trying as much as possible to, I guess, be relevant through films because he only is playing himself, which is completely fine because ultimately, if anybody needs a person in music, it's got to be Kid Cudi, I guess. So this band is put together and they're just like, okay, well, what do we play with all of these people? They don't know. And so eventually, once they go and they start to practice, there is a robot there with a girl from the future who came and got Bill and Ted. She is with them now, and ultimately they open the garage, and there's a robot there to blast every single one of them. Blast every single one of them, they all head to hell. And so ultimately, all the while we're transitioning into Bill and Ted are consistently still going through to their future selves. And the next future self that they go into is a future self in prison, and Bill and Ted are going to a prison and they see their future selves and they're like, "Hey, how is it that you got to prison?" It's like, "Well, hey, like you guys like kept us on the rap for that breaking and entering home from the Foo Fighters guy, and like that's why we went to prison." And so like before that, right before like once they were getting to prison, supposedly they were doing some song in prison. um and they're like, "Hey, you really like that song?" And they're like, "Sure, yeah, we really like that song." So ultimately the robot again appears at this prison, and then so uh it ends up that prison Bill and Ted fight off this robot to where present Bill and Ted could kind of escape, because ultimately prison Bill and Ted were trying to protect their present selves so they could stay alive for this future. But yeah, prison Bill and Ted still didn't have the song. So eventually it gets down to the point to where ultimately Bill and Ted just decide like, well, how about we just go to our elderly versions of ourselves? So that way, like, I'm sure our elderly versions of ourselves have this song. And so ultimately they take the time to do this, and ultimately they meet their elderly selves, and ultimately they find them, and supposedly there is some like music thing that they were given to just be like, "Oh, hey, here, this is a song that you guys did," and on this weird device. And so ultimately like, "Yeah, hey, great, like this is awesome," and they meet their older selves. And so they're raring to go, but the only problem is that there is no phone booth, because ultimately their elder wives went back in time to see their younger wives, to ultimately again do this whole journey about like, hey, your wives should not be like with the present Bill and Ted, leave them, and this and that. So ultimately the robot comes to Bill and Ted, and he is going to like kill them, but the present Bill and Ted go and say, "Well, hey, like we have the song right here. It's right here. We have the song." And so ultimately the robot is just like, "Oh, okay, well, like I'm not going to kill you then, but just to let you know, I accidentally killed like your kids and like all these other like iconic musicians and stuff like that. And Bill and Ted are just like, what? Like, so where are they? And he's like, well, they're all in hell. It's like, well, okay, well, you have to like you have to shoot us then. You have to kill us so we can go to hell to talk to whoever down there to try and kind of get our kids out of hell. So the robot won't shoot him, and so ultimately, because they have the song, and so they break the device that has the song, and so the robot shoots them. They go down to hell, and they go and they kind of like realize that it's like, oh, hey, our daughters are in hell. Good for them, I guess. And then eventually, like all these iconic characters, like, oh, hey, great that you're all here. So they they go to hell just to reasonably like talk to death. And basically they don't do anything like they did in the other movie. It's not like they beat him in any kind of game or this and that. they they basically just reason with death. They ultimately tell him it's like, hey, like you were like we had to sick lawyers on you. It's like if anything, like you were trying to take the name Wild Stallions from us. And he's like, well, hey, yeah, I was a Wild Stallion member, and it's like, and like I was playing some pretty sick bass solos, and he was like, they're like, dude, you were playing like 45-minute bass solos. Like nobody wants to like listen to a bass solo that long. And he was just like, well, like clearly that was the actual best part of your act because nobody listened past that. And so ultimately they're just kind of like, you know what? It's like death, like we get the girls that are kind of schmoozing over death and kind of mentioning like all of his like solo songs when he went solo after he left the band and this and that. And then they mention it's like, you know what, death, like I think you actually like I think that you really want to just like you really want to play again. You really want to like you really want to like you want to do this again. So how about we get you into our band and ultimately you can play again. And so Death is just like, you know what? It's like pretty appealing offer. So all of these people are all in this like UPS car or whatever, and they all go into this car, and they all get sent back to present day and time where everything is like popping off. There's all kinds of bizarrish like future time loop things where all kinds of time period things are just going everywhere. It's going haywire, and so Bill and Ted like are trying to figure out where exactly they were supposed to perform at. And where they were supposed to perform at was right where they were already because they had to figure that out. And so ultimately they stop whatever they're doing and they get a bunch of like concert equipment together, but like Bill and Ted realize that that isn't good enough, that they have to go through an infinite timeline and or infinite number of like timelines and whatever to get every single person who has ever been born to have an instrument in hand to play at any certain number of time, because I guess that would figure out how to beat this thing. And so ultimately they continue to just repetitiously like while Bill and Ted, present Bill and Ted, are going through all these timelines and whatever, and getting all these instruments to all these people. The two daughters of Bill and Ted are having the iconic members practice on things, and so ultimately Bill and Ted come back, and they're like, "Oh, okay, we got to get this done now." And so ultimately they play a song that is severely bland and generic and has no song lyrics to it, and is not a really good song to leave off on, but that's the song that is supposed to unite the world. And so one of the daughters ends up like going like, "Yeah, like we did a song to unite the world, and how great is that?" And basically basically it's just like that is pretty much eventually how the movie just kind of goes off, is just basically saying like, yeah, like the Bill and Ted, they like reconciled with their wives, and like things are working out, things are looking up and up, and like that just is kind of how the movie eventually just kind of just tapers off. There isn't any much real hard shipping like conclusions and this and that. The future is letting us know that like we beat it, we won, and this and that, and everything is fine. All the iconic characters are back to the right timelines that they're in, and everything is back to copacetic normal. And like that's just kind of how the movie just ends. There is a end credit scene at the very end of this credits where you have elderly Bill and Ted that ultimately decide like, well, hey, it looks like we're at the end of our road. So hey, if we're like, before we go, we have to do one last thing. They have both elderly Bill and Ted both like busting out the guitars and amps and stuff like that, and they again, not with any lyrics of any kind, just start riffing on guitars, and then they're like, whoa, whew. So both of them sit down on the amp, and that's just how the movie in its entirety ends. So yeah, that is Bill and Ted Face the Music, for how much that I really wanted to go thoroughly into it, which I kind of wanted to leave some stuff out because there was some stuff that really didn't feel quite important enough to me, but I kind of went in there and kind of mentioned this and that much more so than I thought I would or should. But other than that, I spent almost 40 minutes going into this thing, so I'm going to get uh, out of here because I don't want to spend too much time more than that. So, goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.